So this is one of the most in-depth tests I have ever done. So I have timestamps at the bottom of the video so you can skip to the different parts that you might be interested in. But I recommend watching the whole video if you already own an A7R3 and you want to see how much of an upgrade it is going to be with the A7 IV, because there's a lot of differences with this camera. In some scenarios, the camera is pretty much identical to the A7 IV, but there's some other stuff that's where it's a huge improvement over the A7 IV. And also, if you're interested in the photography side of things, check out my last video. That's where I compared the photography side of things with the A7R3 and the A7 IV. So let's begin the video now. Alright, so today we're going to be comparing the A7 IV and the A7R3. And while I'm comparing, I'm going to be moving back and forth through the shadows and through the light like a madman, just so we can see how the autofocus of these cameras work. And that way we can also see how much highlight we can recover and how much shadow we can recover. So when it comes to both of these cameras, I've been using the A7R3 for around 3 years now. And the A7 IV, I just got it like over a month ago. So I know the ins and outs of the A7R3, but the A7 IV I'm still learning. But from what I can tell, the A7 IV is, oh my god, so much easier to use compared to the A7R3. First of all, we're shooting both these images in 4K 24 frames per second because that's the highest they can shoot with both of these cameras. But with the A7R3, since we have an 8-bit codec compared to the A7 IV's 10-bit codec, we had to shoot in S-Log2, while with the A7 IV we're shooting at S-Log3. So just because of that fact, we're going to have dynamic range differences. And also, with the A7R3, the thing that I always hated about it is that when you're shooting with that camera, oh my god, just stabbed myself in the back. When you're shooting with the A7R3, you always have to overexpose your image by a stop to get a proper exposure on your image. But with the A7 IV, you can just expose it normally, like how you would actually want to do it, so you can see what your image looks like. But with the A7R3, you always had to, when you're exposing for your image, you have to overexpose a little bit, so on the back of your screen the image always looked way too bright. And then I just have to keep in mind that when I get the footage back in post-production, then I can edit it and make it look however I want it to look. So just because of that, I love the A7 IV, the ease of use of the camera, because that way you can just shoot whatever you want to shoot, besides having to worry about, oh, am I exposing the image correctly or not. Also, the A7 IV's codec is way more lenient. So for example, if your image is underexposed, you can bring up the shadows, and if it's overexposed, then you can just bring back the highlights a little bit. But with the A7R2, you have to nail the exposure of your image. If it's not perfectly exposed, which is a stop overexposed, then the image quality is complete garbage. So just because of that, the A7 IV image quality looks a lot better. And you guys can also see, maybe in the sky, you guys can see a little bit of banding with the 8-bit footage from the A7R3. Well, with the A7 IV, the image quality should be a lot better. Now we're going to do a low light test with the camera. We're shooting at f2.8 150 dose shutter with 12,800 ISO with both of these cameras to see how well both of these cameras autofocus. And right here, we can see how the focusing looks on both of these cameras. Let's get back into the shadow. Right here, just see how it looks, how it follows me, how the autofocus is doing. So yeah, let's see how it looks right here. Let's see how it looks right here. Hopefully both of these cameras are keeping me in track. I think that A7 IV is keeping me in track. I don't know about the R3. Now we're going to be looking at the slow motion between these two cameras. With the A7R3, you get a 1080p 8-bit footage that looks pretty good, to be honest. And when we convert it to the A7's 1080p 8-bit, which is the maximum it can shoot and continuous with audio, it looks pretty similar, to be honest. A7 IV's colors are a little bit better, but they're pretty similar. Now we're going to be comparing the 8-bit from the A7R3 to the 10-bit out of the A7 IV. Now you get the 10-bit out of the A7 IV only when you shoot in SNQ mode. If you don't use the SNQ mode, you get 8-bit, but when you use the SNQ mode, you go to 10-bit, which does make a significant difference. Now if we compare these two images, you can clearly see that A7R3 just has this like purple color tint to pretty much all of its, color profiles. Doesn't matter if you're shooting 1080p or 4K, but especially in 1080p, you really see these purple differences. And if we zoom in a little bit, you can see that it's the A7 IV image is a lot more sharper and there's less noise in the image, and the colors look so much more natural and cleaner versus the A7R3, which you can see there's a lot of noise and there's purple fringing all over. A7 IV also has 4K 10 bits 60 frames per second, which looks super nice. It looks like the same exact resolution as if you were shooting 24 frames per second. So if you're shooting in 4K, you can mix in slow-mo footage from the 60 frames per second, and no one will notice that the resolution dropping or anything. And even when we zoom in right here, you can see that the image quality looks great out of it. Now let's say you're gonna shoot some sports, so you're gonna record an elite athlete running. Let's see how the autofocus is. With the A7R3, as you can see, it's actually doing pretty well. Once I start getting closer, you can see that it's starting to lose focus, but honestly it does a pretty good job with the autofocus and slow motion. If you look at the A7 IV, first of all, the image, the colors and everything looks so much nicer. And the thing is that with the A7R3, it was keeping me in focus, but a lot of times it was keeping the focus like on my shirt or like on like my chin or whatever. But with the A7 IV, it keeps it right on the eye until I get to the very end, which loses me because I get close to the minimum focusing distance. But honestly, both of these cameras do such an amazing job when it's slow motion. Both of them look great, but when you compare both of them side by side, you can see that A7R3 obviously has a lot of purple tint to it. I'm not really sure why it does that. It just does. Maybe it's the codec or something. But the A7 IV image just looks super clean, and the colors, everything look natural, and the autofocus works really great. Like right here, for the autofocus I was using animal detect, so the whole time it was just keeping the focus right on the cat's eye, which is just amazing that it works so well even when you have a non-human subject. So for doing wildlife, or even if you're doing sports, the A7 IV is just going to be a lot better, especially the image quality just looks a lot better. Also, because you can do 4K 60 frames per second, which means that if you're shooting in 4K, you don't have to worry about lowering the resolution down if you want to get some slow motion shots, unless if you have to use 120 frames per second. But honestly, since I got this camera, I've been using the 4K 60 frames per second, and I feel like for most scenarios that's more than enough. Now we're going to do a studio test, just to see in a controlled environment what the image quality looks like between these two cameras. First we're going to do 4K resolution, and then we're going to switch to 1080p to see how those two differ. So at 4K resolution, this is what the A7 IV looks like, and this is what the A7R3 looks like. Now when we compare both of these cameras in a studio setting, you can see that both of these images look actually great. We're shooting both of them in the base ISO in 4K 24 frames per second, and even when we zoom in, you can see that both of them are very sharp images. They're pretty much identical. I would say the A7R3 might actually be a tiny bit sharper because I believe downsamples from its 42 megapixel image, so I think you get actually a tiny bit sharper image out of it. And even though it's only 8 bits compared to the 10 bit out of the A7 IV, you still get a great image because since you're in a studio, you're not working with that much dynamic range, so it doesn't really matter that much, and you're not going to be doing crazy color grading with it anyways. Now this is 1080p 10 bits with the A7 IV. This is what it looks like. And now this is with the A7R3 with the 1080p 8-bit codec looks like. Both of them are on the same settings. And this is why you never shoot 1080p with the A7R3. I mean, just look at the image quality difference between these two cameras. I'm just happy that we finally have some good 1080p out of these mirrorless cameras, because otherwise you would have to get at least a Sony FS5 in order to be able to get good 1080p 10-bit colors out of it. So with this camera, as you can see, even when we zoom in, it's so much sharper than the A7R3's 1080p, and also A7R3 has a heavy purple tint to it, while the A7 IV you get a very nice and clean image from it. And here I also compared the 4K with the 1080p just for fun, and they're very similar. Like if you look at them, they're both really nice, really clean image out of both resolutions. The 4K is obviously a tiny bit sharper, but honestly it's not even that much sharper. Like the 1080p out of this camera is very usable professionally. So I would not be scared at all to use the 1080p out of this camera, especially if you want to use like 120 frames per second. You can just combine both of these images very nicely. So in the end, I gotta say, with both of these cameras, you obviously get a great image out of them. I love the flexibility with both of these cameras, but there's some other stuff that these cameras do better. First of all, the A7 IV doesn't have a record limit, so when you're shooting with this camera, you don't have to worry about the 30-minute limit like you do with the A7R III, so you can shoot the camera as long as you want, which is a huge plus, especially if you're hired to do, you know, shoot a conference or something where you need to shoot for like an hour. You don't have to worry about the camera shutting down and then you have to restart shooting again, so that's a huge plus. Also, with the A7 IV, you can easily use it as a webcam. Now with the R3, you can use it as a webcam, which I have done before when I used to stream on Twitch, where you can just get yourself a capture card and just be able to connect it through HDMI, and then from there you can get a feed to your computer and record it that way. But it's so much simpler on the A7 IV, where you can just connect it to your computer using a USB-C cable, and then it just works as a webcam. Like, it's super simple to do, so that's a huge plus. And also, when you connect an external monitor to the A7 IV, or if you're controlling the A7 IV with the mobile app, you don't lose any of the functionality. With the A7R III, once you connect an external monitor or use the mobile app, it shuts down multiple different things. I don't have the list in my head, but one of the main things that it shuts off is the face detect autofocus. That's a pretty big deal. So if you're using if you're doing a professional shoot and you have an external monitor connected to your camera, your autofocus gets worse on the A7R III, while with the A7 IV, you always have eye detect autofocus, which is not in the A7R III either. A7R III, when it comes to video, only has face detect autofocus, which works pretty well. But if you're someone like me who has a giant nose, sometimes it will just focus on the tip of your nose, so your eyes will be out of focus. But with the A7 IV, you have the world's greatest eye focus. Look at this. It just constantly keeps you the focus on the eye. So that's a huge plus. Also, the mobile app for the A7 IV is better. It is the same exact app, but if you say that if it sees that you're using an A7 IV, it will have a different interface where you can do stuff like, for example, you can use the touchscreen on your phone to do focus tracking and stuff. So that's really cool, and I actually been using that a lot. Just so when I'm doing shots, things that you can do focus tracking with the touchscreen of the camera also. But if you're trying to do a shot and then you tap on the screen, it will shake the whole camera, so the whole shot will get shaky. But the fact that you can do it from the mobile app is really useful. Another huge plus of the A7 IV is that it has gyro stabilization, which means that you can take a shaky footage like this. This was shot in 4K 60 frames per second, and this is slowed down. As you can see, it's a very shaky footage, but you can take this footage, put it through Catalyst Browse, and now you have a perfectly smooth image that looks like it was shot on a gimbal. So this camera will make it so that you don't even have to bring a gimbal with you, as long as you're careful. And I didn't have my shutter speed high enough for here, but it still looks pretty damn good. We're just going over the stuff that we saw in the video. Like, obviously when you shoot at the 4K 24 frames per second, even when you have an 8-bit or a 10-bit codec, they pretty much are identical. Like, I don't think the going from 8-bit to 10-bit and 4K resolution is that big of a deal, because with the 4K resolution, there's enough resolution there to make up for the lack of bit depth that you get from the 8-bit resolution. But as you guys saw that when you go to 1080p resolution, there's a huge difference. And I first noticed this difference when I got myself a Sony FS5, because the Sony FS5 has 10-bit 1080p, and the 1080p out of the FS5 looks beautiful, while the 1080p out of the A7R III has always looked terrible. And the main reason for that is the 8-bit codec. 8-bit and 1080p doesn't work that well. You just get an unprofessional looking, soft, purple fringed image. But if you can get yourself a 10-bit 1080p codec, then the image quality looks a lot better. And obviously we saw that the autofocus is so much more improved on the A7 IV. So that's another huge plus. And the slow-mo features are also a lot better, because again, the only slow motion you get out of the A7R III is the 8-bit 1080p that just doesn't look good. But with the A7 IV, if you use the SNQ mode, which is what I recommend that you do, you get the 10-bit 1080p that just looks super clean and super sharp. So that, and even if you were to mix that footage with the 4K resolution, I guarantee you won't be able to tell the difference. Because the thing is that when you use the A7R3 and you mix the 1080p 120 frames per second footage with the 4K 24 frames per footage, you could always tell the difference, mainly because of the purple tint that you would get from the slow-mo footage and how soft it is. You can see that there's a huge difference between those two images. While with the A7 IV, the 1080p and the 4K resolutions are very close to each other. When you do mix the footages out of these two different resolutions, you're really not going to be able to tell the difference. And things that even if you don't want to mix in any slow motion from the 1080p, you can always use the 4K 60 frames per second, and that way you can also get some slow motion. Now the 4K 60 frames per second is an APC mode, so you're not going to be able to shoot it with the full width of the full frame. But again, if you want that full width slow motion look, then honestly just shoot at the 1080p 120 frames per second with the SNQ mode, and you're really not going to be able to tell the difference. But anyways guys, thanks for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions about either of these cameras, make sure to let me know in the comment section below, and I'll try to reply to all the comments I get. And I make videos almost every single day about different camera gear and the stuff I get, so make sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of that. But anyways guys, thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you watch this whole thing. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.